So we're going to be touching on a number of different concepts, but ideally this is a session that's really for those that have some experience with the topic of data security, but you're maybe still be in the testing phases, or you're looking at other ways to improve your company security posture in this area. All right. Without further ado, allow me to introduce our panel. I'm joined here today on my far right, your left, by Ed Adams. He is our subject matter expert today on application security and software quality. He is the CEO from Security Innovation, and also a member of the board of directors for the International Consortium of Minority Cybersecurity Professionals. He's also got a long list of credentials, including research fellow at the Ponemon Institute. And his company, Security Innovation, as well as Ed, have worked extensively with the PCI Security Standards Council, including in the area of learning management. So when it comes to understanding the topics of PCI and being able to communicate those, Ed is definitely one of our experts on the panel here today. Secondly, to his left is Mark Carl. Mark is joining us as the SME on security tool sets and vendor services. Mark was the CTO of EchoSat before it became ControlScan, and now the CEO of ControlScan, providing managed network services and cybersecurity consulting services, specifically, well, of course, across many industries, but also specifically within petrol. He is the vice chair of the Connexus Data Security Committee and active in the Petro Working Group, as well as the EMV Migration Forum, now the US Payments Forum. And so he'll be providing kind of the voice of wisdom in terms of vendor security and integration. And then finally, we have Patrick Raycroft. Patrick is joining us as a subject matter expert for compliance and security organizational governance. Patrick is an associate director at Capra. He is, Capra are leaders in fuel retail, including security, consumer experience, and engagement in the payments space. Patrick's experience includes not only C-store and fuel retail, but also he joins us with a broad range of experience managing other verticals, consulting in other verticals, including retail, major oil, and of course, QSR and grocery. My name is Sam Pfanstiel. I'll be moderating today's panel. I'm from the director, as I mentioned, director of security consulting from ControlScan. I have about 22 years of experience in IT management and security, and I'm also a QSA, a P2PE QSA, a PIN QPA, and so I'll be kind of bringing some of the PCI standards subject matter into the conversation as we try to extend beyond PCI and look at our data security posture as an enterprise. So first, I'd love to just kind of get you guys' take. You all come with a separate pedigree, but we have a lot of overlap in security. It'd be really interesting just to hear kind of what you were observing in your swath of the world with respect to convenience stores, both at the operator level, all the way up to the major oils and vendor level when it comes to key elements of the threat landscape, right? So specifically to threat landscape, what are some of the risks that you guys are seeing out there? Patrick, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Sam. So from my perspective, the primary thing, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record as I go throughout my questions and things like that throughout the day. But namely, I'm going to focus on the sensitivity and the value of data. And we've heard this story before. We hear it every year, right? Encryption, tokenization. How do we bring this to convenience and retail fuel? How do we solve the fleet problem at the forecourt? How do we secure, devalue, and descope PCI data from retail sites? I'm going to take that common theme and expand it a little bit. For those that don't know, data privacy has come to the US and has come in a rather big way with the California Consumer Privacy Act and a number of other privacy acts that states are evaluating at this point, New York, et cetera. That act is really focused on the consumer-focused rights of citizens of California as it relates to the management of their data, whether it's understanding what retailers have, what organizations have on them, right, or requesting that data be deleted. But most notably within that type of regulation and within others that are coming is private right to action in the event of breaches of personal information. So here we've actually escalated to, PCI data obviously represents a significant amount of risk to, all retailers and vendors in this room. But personal information is starting to represent a really significant risk to organizations as well, namely in the aspects of this private right to action in the event that the consumer's personal information is breached. So back to the encryption and tokenization discussion, we're seeing that discussion scale from, we still have to solve the PCI data problem in the retail sites, but we really need to expand the conversation to personal information more broadly, sensitive personal information, and even that of our customers, right, of marketers and things like that. So that's what we're seeing as a pretty big growing concern within the convenience and retail fuel vertical.
Gotcha. Yeah, so private information and the threats of compromise or exploitation, perhaps, of private information. What about you, Mark?
So probably the bigger threats we see today usually revolve around having endpoint security on systems to protect them from potential intruders. So the biggest threats that we're recovering customers from today as they come to us are business email compromises. So, you know, we grew up in this world of PCI, particularly PCI version 3, and we'll talk a little bit about what's happening new in PCI version 4 here in a little bit. But it has all these prescriptive measures that are applied from the card brands to protect card data. But the fact of the matter is, as a merchant, you've got a lot of other risks in your environment outside of the cardholder data, right? It's very important to protect that, and in particular, your acquirers and your card brands want you to protect that because it's very valuable to them, right? And it needs to be protected. If it's valuable to them, it's also valuable to an attacker, and so there's definitely a risk of outside intrusion. And so we provide these defensive measures over the years to protect those cardholder data and POS environments that are very specific to the petroleum market. Very unique environments with forecourts and POS systems and EPSs now as we expand out into removing the payment application from the POS and putting it on an EPS. And then we isolate all that down and we call it the cardholder data environment. We say, here's the prescription for security. And then somebody gives up their credentials by clicking on the wrong link, and then they download ransomware and put it on the back office, and now the back office is locked down with ransomware, and gosh, the cardholder data is still protected, but we can't operate, right, because we're all shut down. Those are the risks that we see today. There's obviously good tools to solve for all of that. Security tools themselves have come a long way in the last 5 or 6 years. One of the examples I like to use is the particular Section 5 of PCI prescription to use antivirus. Antivirus is actually a term that we haven't used in the industry for quite some time, been done away with at this point. So, the days of actually looking at file signatures to see if that's a particular threat, not anymore. If an attacker is trying to attack you, they're building custom ransomware for your environment that's not going to have a signature that's ever been seen before. So those are the particular types of threats that are very risky for retailers, especially larger retailers that have centralized connections to all their remote locations. And so we'll talk a little bit about the tool sets in a little bit that we usually protect it.
Yeah, so malware and loss of business operations and threats that affect things outside of payment data. Well, what about you, Ed? What do you think?
Personally, I think Mark is the biggest threat because he's got the most soothing voice. He could be talking about the most serious cybersecurity attack on record, and you just get the feeling everything's going to be okay because the way he talks about it, just so calming. He's the biggest threat, so right next to me. But in all seriousness, we see third-party supply chain as being a significant threat vector, particularly for convenience stores, retail, and oil and gas, which is the common thread that a lot of us have here. Just because we're so interconnected and interdependent now on data, and data is flowing and being replicated through a number of different third parties, whether it's a point-of-sale system or even in-store advertising and inventory management, and it's so difficult to have a full understanding and appreciation of how to secure that. Whether you're talking about migration to the cloud, adopting private and public clouds, integrating third-party commercial off-the-shelf software, how do you include that in your vulnerability testing and scanning? So third-party risk is something that we see predominantly as a major threat vector in this particular sector.
That's a really good point. Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about a few of those items. The reality is that security isn't just about credit cards. That's why we're all here. So maybe it would help to look at what some exemplary companies, best-in-class companies are doing to address this at the organizational level. Patrick, are you seeing that from single store operators up to major oils and vendors, are you seeing any traits that we could emulate or observe and maybe take from PCI into day-to-day operations?
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, a lot of these best-in-class practices are entirely dependent on organizational size and the risk that your operations pose. But when we think about the best-in-class merchants and what we see with our clients, it's, PCI is an effect, right? It's not the goal. So they take a step back and look at it from an information management program. And that really starts with a set of standards that they are going to bring and operate with across their organization. And these terms are key, right, of not just defining and communicating those, but following them and updating those standards as well. Getting into the details there, right, standards around data classifications, right? I'm hitting on that term a lot, right? What qualifies as sensitive or confidential information within your organization? What's enterprise data that you must protect, right? Data within your back office that must be accessible in order to operate your retail locations. Cryptography standards, so the ciphers and the types of algorithms that are actually being used to protect your data, what should be deprecated within your environment, what shouldn't you be using to protect data in transit, in use, or at rest, and which ones are the preferred and the path forward for your organization. Infrastructure and networking, having standard and strict firewall rules and making sure those are updated and managed and audited on a regular basis. You can go on and on with this list, right? Lots and lots of things that should be focused on. Standards should be defined, they should be communicated and followed and updated. What that all translates to, that's a lot of things, right? As we get into event monitoring and business continuity plans. Everyone in this room probably has dealt with elements of these standards before. I was watching, over the weekend, I was a bit ill and got stuck watching National Lampoon's Vegas Vacation. And in that, there's a scene where he's at the Hoover Dam, and he goes and he pulls out one little rock out of the Hoover Dam, and it starts leaking, and he plugs that with a piece of gum, and another one pops out over here. And he keeps plugging things with gum. My biggest advice on these standards is don't take that approach, right? Don't take the whack-a-mole approach. Don't be Chevy Chase. So here, really, now that most organizations have an understanding of those standards, it's take a risk-based prioritization approach to those standards. What should you be tackling, and in what order? And obviously, that prioritization is driven by the value that particular area provides to your business, which is entirely driven by the risk, as well as that level of investment. So no different than we do on the product side. I think that risk-based prioritization needs to be done for security governance and management as well. And then it's not just execution. I'll hit on that follow and update. These best-in-class organizations are sustained focus on these areas as well. They assign organizational priority to these areas, not just defining them once, putting them into a document, circulating it once and saying, yes, I read that. That isn't an information management program. It's the ongoing management and compliance with those policies and procedures that your organizations define.
It sounds like to me, a lot of what you said reminds me of PCI, right? So there's a lot in PCI that reflects, obviously, positive trends, best practices, business as usual operations from a policies and procedures to training. And so I'm seeing the overlaps right here between a good security practice and one that has followed PCI. Now, but obviously PCI isn't all things to all people, and that's what we're addressing. Obviously, it's the world I sit in, so a lot of times I kind of see things through my lenses. How would you guys, Mark, Ed, are there specific practices that Patrick touched on that you see as kind of really taking an organization beyond that level that they could, that you'd like to discuss?
Please, go ahead.
Sure. I'll get started here ahead of Ed, but the history of a CEO, being asked, are you working inside of a secure environment, and saying, well, my IT team has that under control. They're my IT team, right? And we see it all the time. The CEO thinks the IT team has it, but really what they're working on is operational IT. They really don't understand security, how to implement security, and at risk of not losing their job, they're certainly not going to tell the CEO they don't understand security if that's what he's expecting them to do, right? And we see it all the time. We see large 300-person organizations get attacked. They've got 14 people in the IT team. Not a single one of them has a security certification, right? And they end up with an entire infrastructure breached, no segmentation. You know, none of the standard basic policies applied to the environment that they work in. And that's where the organizational risk really comes from. So if your organization doesn't view security at the CEO and board level today, then you're at extreme risk. So most of what you see in larger organizations today, including branded oil, within the oil brands themselves, is where traditionally your board has had some type of oversight on the financial side. We're starting to see a lot of cybersecurity oversight committees now at the board level, because the board needs to know, outside of an executive staff, what are we doing to protect our environments? Because it's a huge amount of risk. You know, when an oil brand shows up on CNN, whether the entire chain is breached or not, you know, it's brand damage for that oil brand. And so when you get down into the weeds of it and look at how PCI has been applied to that over the years, PCI is very prescriptive about things that you're supposed to do to protect those environments. Policy and procedure is a big part of it, but actually implementing things that will protect the environment is really where it becomes very prescriptive. Now, as Sam knows very well, you know, one of the things we discussed in the PCI annual meeting a couple of weeks ago is PCI 4 is going to take a little bit different approach. And so historically, where we've had these sections of the PCI that were prescriptive and we had to do things that way, and then we had this area called compensating controls, where we could put compensating controls in there, even if it was a control that we were compensating with because we thought we were protecting the environment better than the prescription from PCI because we have more risk in our environment. We still had to have a business justification for that. And so in PCI 4, you're going to see that change. Under a level 1 assessment, you'll see it change where the customer and the QSA can decide either they're going to use the prescriptive description of how this is supposed to be implemented under that specific section of PCI, or there's going to be an option to do something different, right? And the PCI is going to allow for that and say they're going to give the QSA the authority to say either it's prescribed and that's how it's implemented, or you've taken a different approach and the QSA agrees that that approach is as good or better to meet the intent of the actual segment of the standard. And so that gives us a lot more options from a security perspective. And here's a good example. Going back to the example I used before, the PCI 3, which will be the same in 4, actually prescribes antivirus. Now, if you're still using antivirus, then you know you actually have a lot of risks already, because again, the days of finding files that have signatures that are actually viruses or malware, those days have long gone. I mean, if you're under attack today, the likelihood is very high that the malware that's being used was built just for your organization. And that's about the only thing we see in the field anymore. So traditionally, you would put antivirus on, and what they say in the standard is you should apply antivirus to those systems that are at most risk of getting malware and ransomware, right? Or malicious files. That's politically correct to not have to say put it on your Windows machine. But the fact of the matter is we're recovering a lot of breaches today where the entry point was actually a Linux machine. And here's the problem. So you've got antivirus on your Windows machine. You have basically no protections on the Linux box because nobody in your organization understands it very well. Yep. That's an entry point for the attacker. And it gives them a very good open source architecture to install all the necessary tools they need to laterally attack the rest of your organization.
Write their own stuff.
Write their own stuff. Seen it 1,000 times. They've staged an attack inside the organization. Now they're behind the firewall on a Linux box and then attacking all the Windows machines around it. They aren't segmented. So when it comes to antivirus, in the days where we used to be able to say, that's a bad file, don't execute it, now we've moved to new things called advanced endpoint security, managed detection and response, where, you know, it's not enough to have an antivirus that will knock a file down. You have to look at the behavior of an application that's executing using artificial intelligence and behavioral learning to say, okay, am I comfortable with what that application is trying to do, okay? If the application is trying to encrypt data and it's a standard user in your environment, that's probably bad. And so you want the endpoint protection to block that and say, no, we're not going to let that application execute and lock up all of our files with ransomware. And being able to detect that is only half of it. Being able for a human to know that something like that just occurred in your environment is just as important. Because if you've got that happening in your environment, let's say your application, your endpoint security misses something, right? Because it's not 100%. It might be 99.5% foolproof. But what about the other 0.5? What if you miss something? Now you've got a lateral movement, nobody's watching, and you're the one that ends up on the news with a breach for 6 months that nobody ever recognized, right? Mm-hmm. And so some of these things have really progressed very well in the last 5 years, way beyond PCI. You might not even find them in your CDE, but they will help you reduce the risk, the other risks that you have as a business in your actual retail environment.
All right, you mentioned CDE, and that's an important concept in PCI, right? But we've been preaching for years, I mean, everybody on the stage, and probably many of you, about reducing the size of the CDE. But your organization didn't get smaller. You didn't add fewer endpoints, right? In fact, I'd venture a guess you probably have a bigger surface area, attack surface, between car washes and ATMs and loyalty systems and third-party vendors. So we're shrinking the size of the CD and expanding the size of the threat. Mm-hmm. So, Mark mentioned, antivirus and software development, these application engineers that are really using their talents for evil instead of good by writing applications that are really, is that a threat to those of us who are using, legitimate applications, commercial off the shelf, or possibly customized applications?
Sure. Well, first of all, listen, all applications have a heavy software component, which by default makes them non-legitimate, because software is just inherently flawed. But a couple of themes that Patrick and Mark were talking about that I think are important to make sure that folks fully appreciate as talismans of a high-performing security organization. The first is culture, and then the second is threat modeling, or what I consider threat modeling. So from a culture perspective, if you are fortunate enough to have an organization where security is considered a high-risk top priority, then you are much more likely to be enabled from a budget perspective, a staff perspective, and an empowerment perspective to take the necessary steps to protect your organization. Now that has to come at the C level, not just the CISO or CSO level, but the CEO level and the board level. If you don't have that, and a lot of us in the organization sitting in the audience don't have that, then it's even more imperative to practice what these two gentlemen have been talking about, and I classify as threat modeling, which is looking at all of the systems that you've got and determining which ones are posing the greatest risk with the highest likelihood of exposure to your organization, and putting your resources there first, because you can't put resources to cover everything on your attack surface. It's not possible. Not a single organization can do that. And threat modeling to me is the one activity that I hear organizations do, and organizations call it different things. A risk-based approach to cybersecurity, risk rating, whether it's applications, servers, whatever the IT assets are, and making sure that the highest risk, highest priority assets are getting addressed first. And like Mark said, a lot of organizations don't necessarily realize that these Linux servers sitting there are high-risk assets because they don't have built-in protections, and once someone gets access to it, because of the nature of open source and being able to write your own tools and configurations, heck, you can recompile the entire kernel in the Linux server and then no one knows what's in there except the person who did it. Those are very high-risk assets that you have to put attention on. So for me, culture and threat modeling are two massive indicators of a mature organization or a high-performing organization with respect to cybersecurity. I'm sure everyone here will be able to determine whether or not their organizations can fit the culture binary, 1 or 0. But the threat modeling is important regardless of that. It's just even more important if you don't have that cultural piece in there. So I didn't address your question about software and applications specifically, but I really felt that was an important point to make sure we covered it.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing some recurring themes, right? So risk, is about more than just what someone prescribes. It's really about taking a holistic approach and evaluating organizational risk that's specific to your own exposures. And so PCI can't do that. Like, it literally cannot, because it has to be extensible and it has to be focused on credit card transactions specifically, but transactions more broadly speaking.
But again, so going back to culture, just a quick story for you. So a client of ours, they process a lot of data, and they have a third-party call center that they use for support. So if someone can't get into their account, they call the support, I can't get into our account. Well, this organization, their IT organization, had built a tool, a utility. It's called the password cracking tool. So when someone calls in, a customer, and says, I can't access my account, the call center personnel is trained to say, oh, no problem. They go and they pull up the password cracking tool. They crack the user's password, give them the password, and then reset it for them. And of course, the organization saw no problem with that because it was enabling good customer service. Well, holy crap, it's violating a whole bunch of other problems, from privacy to data protection to, I mean, this is a third-party outsourced call center. So this is, again, an IT convenience because the culture of that organization was not cybersecurity focused. It was all driven by the bottom line and making sure the customers were happy. They literally built a hacking tool that exposed them to a myriad of compliance problems, privacy problems, and the CISO at that organization that discovered this ran it all the way up the flag. Of course, she asked first, well, why didn't anyone say anything about this? And no one wanted to say anything because they didn't want to risk their jobs. They didn't want to be a troublemaker. And it was working. Things were working, at least for the customer perspective and the customer service perspective. So this CISO now has recognized that as an organization that does not have that culture of cybersecurity first. And as a result, she wants to get the heck out of there because she feels like she's set up to fail. And I feel horribly for the CISO because she's doing the right things, but she's not set up for success in that environment. And that's just a culture where, if she stays and tries to affect change, most likely she's going to fail anyways because she won't have the support from a budget perspective, staff perspective, executive perspective, and culture perspective. And any one of those rocks is difficult to push up a hill, and she's got 4 of them and only 2 arms.
I don't know about you guys, but the organizations that I've actually seen have the best culture, the best buy-in to information security, it's going to sound dark, they're the ones who have been breached, right? I mean, they're the ones who have gone through the pain, right? And don't be those people.
They've applied the
necessary
necessary policies because they've had to recover from a breach.
Well,
we
exactly.
do
they've
see
woken
that.
up,
We do see
right.
a lot of strong security in organizations that have recovered already.
Yeah.
It doesn't change the likelihood they'll be breached again, though, by the way. So,
No.
statistically speaking, even though they have that many controls in place after being breached, the chances that they'll get breached again is actually pretty high. And so just to add on, I think, to kind of what these guys were saying, we're talking a lot about risk-based approach, and I know, a guy who's trying to operate 10 stores probably is asking himself, what the hell is a risk-based approach? I really don't know what that is or how to go about it. So here's a simple rule, okay? 2 big areas in doing a risk assessment, humans and systems, okay? And from a 10 to 0, automatically, humans are 10, okay? Just a 10. All of your systems can be ranked from 10 down to 0. But humans are obviously your biggest risk. And a story, again, that I heard last week from my team, and I hear this at least weekly now. A banking partner of ours sends us a referral and says, hey, these guys need help. And so we go in, a controller has clicked on a link. Number one, multi-factor authentication is actually enabled in Office 365 in this environment. However, a new controller, he's been there 2 months, IT hasn't gotten around to enabling MFA on his particular account yet. And so he clicks on a link, dumps his credentials. Now an attacker's got access to his email. So the attacker logs into his email and sends a $500,000 wire request to the bank and says, I need this money wired to this account. Fortunately, even though they wired it, the bank recognized it was suspicious, called the company, and then they were able to claw that money back. And it was an international account, so the ability to claw money back internationally is actually a pretty slim chance. In this case, they were. But that's a breakdown of almost every control. Okay, you got a human breakdown. Don't click on stuff that you shouldn't be clicking on, and dump your credentials into things that don't look legitimate. In fact, if there's not another factor of authentication, don't dump your credentials at all. Because all of you organizations at this point, as prescriptive as it is in PCI, should be doing some type of multi-factor authentication on everything. Inside the PCI environment, outside, it doesn't matter. You guys have all seen some of the horror stories out there, and I can tell you they happen even in petroleum every single day. It does happen. You know, you don't hear a lot about it because, you know, a 10-store chain who gets breached isn't going to be on the CNN. They might be on the local news, maybe at night, but it does happen. We recover those things all the time. So policy breakdown. IT took 2 months, still hadn't enabled MFA on this one account. And it's a financial controller. I mean, the guy obviously has access to financial records and everything else, and his email, and can send requests to banks to wire money. And so you got to strengthen those policies and say, okay, we're not going to board a user unless MFA is enabled, right?
There you go.
We're not going to have a policy that says within 90 days we'll have MFA after getting this employee boarded.
That's the new 0 day.
That's the new 0 day, yeah. 0 day human error, right?
Yes.
And so, you know, you got to look at the risks, and you got to look at the humans as risk number one, right? And then after that, if you're running a 10-store chain, look at every system you have in those stores, right? And ask yourself one question. Could I operate this store tomorrow if that system was gone? Because that is what it looks like when that system is attacked. It's just not there anymore. It's either got ransomware on it, or it's been disabled by the attacker, or they've done something to keep that particular device from operating, or used it to attack the rest of your network. So every single system can operate without it. Can you operate without your back office? Can you operate without the manager's PC? Tough question here, but can you operate without pumps? They are coming to the network now, okay? They are another attack vector. Just go through each inventory system and say, can I operate without it?
Well, and the thing is, so I mean, we do this in our personal lives every day, and most of us don't realize it. When you leave your house in the morning, do you lock your front door? How many people lock their front door? I do.
Ed has a good reason today to lock his front door.
I actually do. But, so how many folks have an alarm system on their house? Okay. How many folks have an alarm system on their house on the second floor? A couple do, right? So, but a lot of folks don't. So the number of folks that lock their door are very high. A number of folks that have an alarm system a little bit smaller. A number of folks that have an alarm system on the second floor a little bit smaller. It's because you're perceiving threats in risk-ranked basis. So I don't have an alarm system on my second floor because my second floor is about 18 feet off the ground. It's going to be difficult for someone to get in there, much more difficult than going in through a window or my front door or a basement window. So I decided to not put a mitigating control in terms of PCI on my second floor windows. So we do this kind of threat modeling every single day in our personal lives, and you don't need any fancy tools any more than a whiteboard and a marker to do risk rating for your business, whether you have 1 store, 10 stores, or 100 stores. You just have to list out the assets you're trying to protect, figure out how they might be able to get compromised. That's called attack surface. And then figure out how to protect them by ticking off the most easily accessible attack surfaces. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, you know, I had the fun experience of going down and checking out the exhibit hall, you know, and looking at all the technology that's going up there that we're going to get a chance to see starting tomorrow. That's a lot of threats. That's a lot of attack surface, right? And so that's a challenge. Number one, it needs to be done. There's no way around the personal exercise. But let's talk technology, because we love technology, and we love what technology can do for us. So there's got to be some answers. Maybe we can make this kind of a lightning round. There's got to be some good, actionable software, hardware, vendor options that will kind of put us in the right frame of mind to take what you've just taught us, which is good threat modeling and risk management, and turning it into something that we can invest in to help us kind of reduce or mitigate some of those risks. What are some of your favorite ones that you've seen here come to market recently, or, I mean, you mentioned antivirus, Mark, doesn't really cut it anymore. We've got to look beyond signature-based algorithms. What do you guys think?
I would first start that by saying exactly what you're hitting on. The rapid change of technology within not just convenience and retail fuel, but all retail, it is also driving a rapidly expanding list of vendors that you as organizations are leaning on and outsourcing data and critical processes to, et cetera. It's just natural. They're becoming very focused, vendors are becoming very focused on their core competencies of delivering very specific parts of the value chain, of delivering an experience to consumers or to operate. So with that, I think one of the, if I go back to my earlier comments around the things that organizations should be focusing on from a policies and an approach perspective, third-party risk assessments is really important here. I think humans are undoubtedly number one in the risk to your organization. Systems are definitely there. Third parties are right up there. If you look with some of the larger breaches, the larger threats that are presented to your organizations. And namely, if you look at, I know the common term, everyone, the buzzword is IoT, right? But when you look at more and more devices that are microservice type of devices, right? They're sensors for inventory, sensors for temperature on food items, et cetera. If you look at the controls that are within the applications that run on those devices, they are generally scarily very, very weak. And namely, it's been a productized first, security later for a lot of the IoT products that are coming to market. Assess those products very carefully. They represent just as much of a risk of entrance into your network and for lateral movement to other more business critical systems. But there's, studies, lots of studies out there with a lot of these IoTs. I think it was an insulin pump transitioning to like healthcare that had default credentials on it. You could access that insulin pump within a human with default credentials on it. That is one of the scariest concepts to everybody sitting in this room, is that if I'm putting more and more technology in my body, these firms aren't designing with security first like what we're talking about. So I'd say third-party assessments and assessing their controls within IoT, the broad topic and spectrum of IoT is really critical.
Yeah. And that's something you can take, immediately when you walk downstairs and you're talking to these vendors. It's like, what have you done? How can you reassure me?
Oh, it definitely asked that question. And I've got a very quick follow-on to that. It's a 4-letter word, followed by a 10-letter word. It's data encryption. You won't be able to control how third parties secure their stuff all the time, but for the most part, you do have control over how you can secure your data. So data encryption, to me, I'm a big fan of encryption, and it at least keeps it out of scope from a PCI perspective if things do get disclosed for the most part. So encrypt what you can. Ask your vendors whether or not they encrypt data when it's being transmitted, stored, or received, and if not, make sure that your service level agreement has some kind of assumption of liability on their perspective if they're not willing to meet your data encryption requirements.
That's good.
So Patrick spoke very eloquently to the third-party vendor issues that we see. And so I'll just throw that into my previous analogy. So your internal people are threat level 10, right? Outside large groups of third-party people, like 10 and a half. Above your inside 10 level.
Because they're people and third parties.
Yeah. You've got the third party who doesn't have a focus on security. Right. And now they've also got humans involved in that process as well. So yeah, it's risky. Vendors are you should definitely ask your vendors what they're doing from a security perspective, what kind of focus they have as an organization on security, test their systems. I know sometimes that's difficult. A lot of times some third party, like your brand, is putting some kind of system in your store that they need or they want. You might need to test that, but you don't actually have an agreement with the vendor. Well, that's actually a PCI violation in and of itself if it's in your CDE. But if it's not, then you still need to be doing some testing. You need to figure out how to make that work with anything that's coming into your environment, no matter who is deciding to put it there. And I see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd here, and you guys all know I came up from the network side, so I usually like to go down that rabbit hole. So there is a way to segment this thing to protect yourself from both the outside, your own people, and third-party vendors. It's called segmentation. We all hear it all the time, but the fact is there's not a lot in your environment that actually needs to talk to anywhere in the world, right? And so I know when we implement network, on the CDE where the point of sale sits, We only allow that segment to talk to a handful of locations that the POS requires either to get its updates or to actually process encrypted transactions to us or the acquirer, wherever they're going. And that's it. So even if the machine was compromised, an attacker was able to gather a big glob of credit cards, they've got no way to send them anywhere, right? They're just going to stay in that environment that's locked down. Well, that's at least the intention, right? And then you've got a third-party vendor segment, right? Those guys probably don't need to talk everywhere in the world either. They're probably a handful of addresses you can whitelist and say, okay, here's my vendor segment. It's got my tank monitor. It's going back to the tank monitor vendor, whatever. Whatever the IoT device might be or any other type of device, whitelist it. Okay, you may have one PC where you've got a clerk that needs to browse the internet for some reason, and that one PC is hooked up on a single port by itself in a single VLAN, and only that machine can see all of the world. And then you isolate that machine from every other segment in the store. And that's how you go about segmenting the network to make sure that your high-risk environment you're providing to that clerk doesn't create high risk for the other environments in your stores.
Yeah, now, I can actually follow up on that. So years ago, my firm was actually the QSA that conducted an audit on one of Mark's systems. And that's actually how we got to know each other years ago. And
Still hold it against him.
I don't blame you. But my team reported that it was the easiest audit they'd ever done because the network was so highly segmented and things were walled off so well that even if everything went to hell, it was a very, very small exposure point. And so network encryption, network segmentation, absolutely. Great way to reduce your attack surface and minimize damage should someone get in, which is an assumption you need to make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and segmentation is more than just technology too, right? We talk about, and I think you mentioned it earlier, Ed, the idea of segmenting people, roles, responsibilities. You know, we talked earlier about application security, and it occurs to me, you know, when you were mentioning, people being a high risk is processes also being critical to application development, whether it be a third party. I think it was a 2018 Ponemon study that said that 61% of third parties, or the CISOs that had been surveyed, 61% of them, I should say, had experienced a third-party breach where one of their selected vendors had been breached in the previous year. And that's pretty dramatic. So using processes like a software development lifecycle, which is in and of itself secure, is one way in which to segment, right? Because if you have a developer who can push their own code to production, that's not segmentation. Just like if you have an application that can communicate across a firewall with another application, that's not segmentation. So, using a quality assurance or a separation of duties model to allow someone who's not actually able to access the code or make changes to actually QA and, of course, push that code out. So I mention that because it also ties to the last topic we're going to touch on briefly. We've got about 15 minutes left. We do have an opportunity for Q&A. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the new PCI standards and how we can use those to improve our security. If anyone does have any questions, feel free to approach the mics. We will have to only take the questions from the mics, so just line up behind one of the mics, and at the end of this session, we'll take those questions. So many of you may be aware that there are some active changes. It's probably one of the most active years that we've had with PCI in a while, and next year will be even more active. Those of you who may have been at the North American Community Meeting may have already heard some of this, but I wanted to give you just some of the quick updates that are relevant here today. So PCI DSS4 is coming, and it's not just, well, let's go ahead and use a bigger number. It is truly going to be a dramatic change. Now, in principle, as Mark alluded to earlier, a lot of the testing requirements for the standard-based testing approach is not going to change all that dramatically. In fact, as you read through it, you'll find that pretty much the same types of controls will still be in place. But it is important to note that they have completely almost redrafted many parts of the standard, specifically with respect to the intent of the requirements, which are now being documented alongside each testing requirement control. They've also relabeled, rather than calling them requirements, we're calling them security objectives. So there will be just some new nomenclature. But as Mark mentioned, flexibility on using an alternative security approach. I think one of the ones that hit in a previous subversion release was the idea, well, I don't necessarily want to have 7 characters for all my passwords that are complex with numbers, uppercase and lowercase. I want to use an entropy-based approach to demonstrate that my passwords are secure. And PCI said, yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. But that will be among other, we can't, I'm not with the PCI Council specifically, but PCI can't predict every possible technology that will come out to address some of these security challenges. So allowing that to be part of the reporting process. And as Mark said, the entity being assessed will have the ability to say, this is how we met it. We did use an objective-based approach, meaning we identified the objective of the control and we met it through a rigorous process that can be documented. And then there is the possibility that we're looking at, and I'll tell you about the RFC process in a minute, but there's the possibility we may be looking at more encryption on trusted networks. So those in the payment space, we generally look at the idea of a CVE being trusted and then public untrusted networks being outside of that. But PCI is pushing, there are stakeholders within PCI that are pushing for more encryption, maybe across especially sensitive areas, not just data at rest, but data in transit. The RFC process, for those not aware, is getting ready to kick off, and I would encourage all of you, all hands on deck, if you're a participating organization in PCI, read over the standard. It is going to be very voluminous and worthy of inspection. Any comments on PCI DSS, guys, before I talk about SSF and
Well, just one point that I was thinking about as you were saying that, Sam, is that taking this approach now with kind of the changes in 4.0, where we as an organization and a vendor come in and say, hey, look, we have a better model for this that secures it better than what the prescription is great. But the other thing it prevents, and this happens to us at Connexus oftentimes, as Alan can attest to, is that people bring us things, and because the PCI is so prescriptive, they say, we need to do this because it's required by PCI, right? And so this allows us to kind of get around it. I know what happens everywhere else in every other industry as well, because we work in a lot of them. And it kind of gets that out of the way. But so now it's not really possible when it's not so prescriptive to come back and say, this is how you have to do it, and this is a requirement. And so we're going to do it this way, right? Because then you look at an entire industry, and when somebody says that, and it's not a requirement, and maybe not implemented in the most secure way, it prevents others from implementing things that might be more secure. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of takes that away from the original standard.
But by the same token, it will create more dialogue. And to Ed's point, that is, that's what we're trying to foster here, is dialogue about what is the best approach for us. So how can we take that outside of PCI and say, let's foster that same culture and dialogue around what are the best controls for us, with respect to other elements that you need to protect. Mm-hmm. The next is a big one. It's the Software Security Framework. I'm not sure if you can read the text there, but this has been announced for over a year. We've been kind of seeing this coming, but we actually have all of the documents now have been published for the Software Security Framework, available for free on the PCI Security Standards website. And this really ties directly to what we're talking about, extending PCI framework to use in other cases. Specifically, of course, I work in point-to-point encryption, so I'm using some of the same software, or rather, same security principles to protect keys, encryption keys, sensitive encryption keys, and other certificates and things of that nature that aren't necessarily cardholder data. The same thing can be applied with PII, as we discussed earlier. So the Software Security Framework recognizes that, and it's starting to compartmentalize or create modules for protecting other types of data that are relevant to transactions. But the SSF is going to replace PADSS going into 2022. There's a long phase-out period, as you can see here. But primarily, the key takeaway here is to be prepared to understand more about SSF as a modular approach to your own payment application validation requirements, if you have any, or your vendor's PADSS application requirements, because it will be rolling out here within the next year as the program goes live in Q1 and the assessors begin to be trained. So there will be a almost a 3-year overlap as far as allowing both standards to coexist. A key element here, too, is software lifecycle or software development lifecycle, but a secure lifecycle which can be independently audited from the actual software. So if you guys are application development companies, you can actually have your own processes audited separately, listed on the PCI website, as we have a secure software development life cycle, or what I talked about earlier as far as separation of duties and other documentation requirements. And oh, by the way, also our application code is also secure. That sort of modular approach allows organizations to be more quick to get to market with their new application releases, and everyone benefits from that. And then finally, P2PE 3.0, pet interest of mine, but in many respects, we're just seeing P2PE evolve and become a larger aspect of encryption, to the gentleman's point earlier about protecting the data across the transaction systems, descoping the environment as a means of protecting the data. So I think that's pretty much it. I just want to, actually, before we do the takeaways, any questions? I think we had a question earlier.
You kind of answered the last one a little bit with talking about point-to-point encryption, but I did have a question about end-to-end encryption, and when is that going to happen, and will that sort of, I don't want to say take away the threat, because there'll never be a threat, but obviously we're shifting the conversation to data protection now. 2 or 3 years ago, all we were concerned about was cardholder data. So I'm curious about end-to-end. How does that end? And then as far as a global threat protection, what do you guys think about tools like Splunk and Alien Vault and Logarithm as a top-level tool to sort of plug in and correlate potential risk happening across your network?
Yes, absolutely. I'll take the P2PE one, and then maybe I'll pass the tools off. But absolutely. So end-to-end encryption, for those not aware, really there's 2 separate usages of that term that sometimes you'll hear, and they can be confusing. The term has actually been around for longer than point-to-point encryption as an idea of something that's provided by your acquirer, where it's end-to-end, but really it's not the end, right? It's only encrypting the data to the acquiring entity before they pass it to the brands. No, it's fully encrypted from there on. You better believe none of those entities are connecting to Visa and saying, I'm just going to send you this data in the clear. But it is not it's not the same encryption, not the same encrypted payload. And in messaging technologies and other things, we talk about end-to-end encryption, like the user is encrypting all the way to the other user. We don't have that in payments ecosystem because the other end is the issuer, generally for a credit card transaction, and the brands already, the card brands, the brand networks already handle a lot of that encryption. So that's one usage of the term end-to-end encryption. The other usage is as a generic term to say anything that's not validated. So one is a superior type of a term, and one is a more generic term. And so therefore, it's good to clarify when you're having those conversations about what we're seeking. The idea of being further down the road, encrypting further and further away from the origin point, absolutely valuable. But keep in mind that because of interoperability of standards and also interoperability of vendors, we can't always demand that one encryption key make it all the way from one end to the other. So we have to go through those retranslation events if we're going to have an interoperable environment. And from best practices for key management, you want to minimize the number of people that have those encryption keys. So we don't want to necessarily give both ends of the transaction an encryption key. You really only want to have it within your sphere of influence and control. So excellent questions. Love to talk about it more afterwards if you'd like, but maybe somebody can take the Splunk and
SIM. It's the same question. Security incident and event monitoring. Basically, it's those applications. So Splunk, Alien Vault, you mentioned, these are very good tools. We have our own called Siphon that we actually don't sell. It's our internal platform that we use for the service that we provide. And this is really the key. Okay, so you have 2 levels above SIM, which is what you're talking about. You have managed SIM, where you've hired somebody else to do it. And then you have managed detection and response, where not only are they actually doing the SIM, but they're also watching the correlation to look for suspicious activities in the environment. And that's kind of how the stack goes up. And so all the tools are great. They all give you kind of the same capabilities. All of it is really not important unless you've got somebody who knows how to build the rules, knows how to correlate events, and can watch for actual suspicious activity. And so a good SOC team, a great SOC full of good analysts can use any one of those tools to find threats.
But you can't also review data that you don't have.
Correct.
Right, so log data that remains on the systems from which the origin of the data, origin of the log information, not only does it prevent detection and response, but it also makes the forensic investigator's job incredibly difficult to go back and figure out quickly, promptly, what was the source of the issue, and of course address the threat, because that time to response and then the time to resolution are two separate metrics, and getting the threat removed from the environment in a post-breach situation is also super important. So
I just want to build on that for a second. The operational and the performance impacts of those tools need to be considered as you're going through and implementing them. Little side story client as well. Went in and built in Splunk for and pulling logs from a number of different critical business applications and within their stores and within their e-commerce environment. When they did that, they didn't necessarily go through and evaluate the impact on the applications that they were implementing Splunk within, and what ended up happening is actually Splunk, those tools have some tendencies in order to be secure, to make sure that, this is just a very small example, right? They make sure that the logs, if they do not have connectivity to those applications, will actually lock down the logs from editing, right? So the logs themselves become read-only. Well, if your application doesn't actually understand that it's read-only and it's trying to access a read-only and write to it, and that application can't respond to it, like create a new log file, something like that, it can crash itself. Mm-hmm. So they ended up having these massive events where, it took a while to find this, but massive events where their performance and operations was being critically impacted because of their SIM. So just think about that. And, a lot of these tools as they go in, fantastic tools, but think about when we put them into place, thinking about the performance and the operational impact of those tools as well.
Good. Any other questions? So today we learned about a great number of things. I hope you enjoyed the format of kind of coming at this kind of a central theme from multiple perspectives and sharing some of our experience. We learned that PCI compliance obviously is a very important part of your program, but it must be a part of a larger security program. We talked about risk, assessing risk and using a governance framework that allow you to address risk both for compliance and regulatory, but also financial responsibility and reputational risk, addressing those within your organization. Looking at that both culturally as well as with your program and your policies and your systems holistically. So not looking at risk as something that is unique to PCI, but really across the organization, and then addressing it holistically. SIM is a great example, right? Using individual syslog systems to try to aggregate log data where you could leverage a vendor that can supply a more extensive aggregation capability is certainly something that would be holistic from a technology standpoint, but holistic as they were saying also includes the idea of addressing, do you have the right staff to interpret those and write the rules, as well as make sure that you're not impacting your business. And then finally, some of those changes that we went over, we want to make sure that you guys are informed and up to date on that. What do those mean for your organization from software development? I think one thing I may not have really made perfectly clear earlier when we were talking about the use of the SSF framework is that it can be applied to other application types that don't handle cardholder data. I mentioned key data, but actually PCI will be releasing other modules for both SaaS-based applications as well as modules specifically drafted for use on commercial off-the-shelf devices, which have heretofore been unaddressed by PCI. So those modules will allow you to look at other aspects of your environment that aren't under the traditional PA-DSS model and see how that affects your security. Again, little housekeeping as we come to a close. You will receive that short survey about this session in your email, so make sure you take a look at that. Give us high marks so we can come back next year. But of course, do fill out that survey for every session that you attend. And as we mentioned earlier, you can purchase a recording of this session and all the sessions directly up the escalator. They have those for sale. I believe the price is somewhere around $249, depending on your badge type and whether or not you already have access to that. Again, appreciate you guys being here today. Enjoy the show.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.